She pressed it against my sternum before she finished the sentence. Not a shove. Not a tap. A flat placement of her palm, phone underneath, warmth bleeding through the screen, and she left it there while the words were still between us. The argument was about the rankings. Always the rankings. 4 national competitions, 2 sponsorship cycles, 1 industry panel where we sat side by side and spent the whole session ignoring each other with remarkable discipline. The hand stayed. She felt it stay. I watched the exact moment she realized. Her voice dropped. Her eyes moved from the screen to my face. The sentence she'd been building lost its last words. Her hand there. Neither of us moved yet. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description, tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe. The summit was held annually in a glass tower in Chicago in the first week of October, when the city had made its peace with the cold and the design industry had made its annual pilgrimage to argue about things that mattered less than they argued about them. 4 consecutive years I had attended. Vielle Marchetti had attended for 4 consecutive years. We had, in that time, developed the specific relationship that exists between 2 people who are always in the same rooms and have never had a conversation that lasted longer than 4 minutes and have spent most of those 4 minutes disagreeing. The disagreements were never small. That was the thing about Vielle. She did not do small disagreements. She had a particular way of stating a position that made it feel like a fact the room had simply failed to notice yet, and she deployed this approach with an evenness that I had, over 4 years, developed a complicated and private response to. My name is Cass Lavrenz, lead design director at Meridian Studio for 3 years, which means I am responsible for the visual identity work of clients who pay enough that the work has actual consequence. 30 years old in this industry since 24, with a specific reputation built with my hands and my eye and my judgment. The only person in any room who had ever made me feel like that reputation was a thing I was still in the middle of proving, was Vielle Marchetti. Vielle was 31. She ran Anchor Lab, which was smaller than Meridian by headcount and larger by cultural noise, the kind of studio that worked with fewer clients and charged more for the privilege, and produced work that the industry spent the following 6 months arguing about whether it was brilliant or precious. She was tall and unhurried and dressed in the specific way of people who understood that clothing was a designed object, which meant she was always slightly more considered than anyone else in the room without appearing to try. She had dark hair that she wore loose at events and pulled up in the particular way of someone who found neatness useful rather than flattering. She had the kind of face that looked better in motion than in photographs, which I had noticed because I had seen the photographs, and then seen her across conference rooms and understood the distinction. We had been placed on the same panel the first year, which was a program coordinator's mistake that neither of us had acknowledged as the origin point it was. The panel was about identity systems and future-facing brand language, and Vielle had said, into the moderator's third question, that the trend toward maximum legibility was producing work that communicated everything except meaning, and before I had decided to speak, the words were already out. Legibility and meaning were not opposites, and conflating them was the kind of argument that sounded profound at a distance. She had looked at me, not with irritation, with the particular sharpening that happens when someone says a thing you have not quite allowed yourself to dismiss. The moderator had moved on. Vielle and I had not spoken for the rest of the panel. The following year we had been on adjacent panels and had spent the lunch break at opposite ends of the same room. The year after that, she had won the industry's principal award for identity work, and I had given the award's contextual presentation, which the program committee had apparently thought was a reasonable configuration. Standing at the podium, describing the work without being able to call it what I privately thought it was, which was the most precise and formally demanding thing anyone had produced in the category in 5 years, had been one of the stranger professional experiences of my career. She had received the award without visible emotion. Afterward, in the reception, she had crossed the room and said, "You described the geometry accurately. There was no way to answer that cleanly. What the work had done was describe what was there. And she knew that. And she was saying it back." She had gone to talk to someone else before the exchange could become anything longer. I had stood with my wine and thought about the specific weight of that sentence for longer than it warranted. This year, the 4th year, we had both been invited to give keynotes. On the same day, in the same track. Hers in the morning, mine in the afternoon, which meant the audience would spend the first session absorbing her argument and the second session measuring mine against it. Not because the program committee had designed it that way, but because the program committee had made the miscalculation of giving us adjacent slots without reading closely enough to understand that our arguments were not parallel. They were in direct conversation. They had been in direct conversation since that first panel. The committee had simply produced the conditions for the conversation to happen publicly. 3 days before the summit, when the program guide went live, the title of her talk landed like a clean strike. Against the legible. Read it twice. Sat with it. Closed the laptop and stood at the window and thought about the argument she was about to make to 500 people, and the argument I was about to make to the same 500 people 4 hours later, and the fact that we had been having this argument in fragments and deflections and 4-minute hallway conversations for 4 years. Priya, my creative director, was the kind of person who made complex things feel manageable. Calling her that evening was not an option, because what was complicated was not the kind Priya could address. It was the kind only Vielle Marchetti made complicated, which had its own private taxonomy. The 3rd section of my keynote got rewritten that evening. Not because Vielle's abstract had changed my argument, because reading it had clarified what my argument was actually for. At the registration desk, we arrived at the same time. Not by design, the same flight from New York. We had discovered this fact at baggage claim, standing 3 feet apart waiting for bags, exchanging the specific silence of 2 people deciding simultaneously whether to acknowledge the situation or let it resolve itself by continuing to stare at the carousel. She spoke first. "You submitted the Callaway identity to the awards this year." Meridian did. "Yes." She said. "The typography decision in the secondary system was interesting." The word interesting from Vielle Marchetti was not neutral. 4 years of context had established this. The Callaway team wanted something that would read at a distance, was all there was to say. She said, "It reads at a distance. It also reads as though it's trying to." She was looking at the carousel rather than at me, which was the version of Vielle Marchetti that was most difficult to account for. The one who said sharp things while looking somewhere else. "We could argue about this now, or argue about it in front of 500 people tomorrow," was the response. She said, "I was thinking both." The bags arrived. The elevator opened at 12, her floor. She stepped out. She turned back before the doors began to close. "Your talk is in the afternoon?" she said. "Yours is in the morning." She said, "I'll try to leave you something to work with." The doors closed. 2 floors to 14. The word try and what it was doing in that sentence sat in the elevator with me all the way up. The pre-summit reception existed in glass-walled rooms high enough to see the lake, with a catering team that had learned to make small food look significant, and an open bar that most attendees visited twice. 4 years of these had produced a working fluency. The right conversations, the brief acknowledgement of relationships that sustain themselves on exactly this kind of annual maintenance. Thea Ballard was mid-sentence about a renovation project when I became aware of Vielle entering the room. Didn't turn immediately. Let the sentence finish. Let it be what it was, rather than what it would become if I turned while it was still in progress. Then the room got rearranged. Val was across it in a dark dress that was, in the specific way of her clothing choices, exactly as considered as everything else she wore. speaking to the program director Holt, who had been running the summit for 11 years and regarded the industry's arguments with the weary affection of someone who had stopped expecting resolution. She had a glass of wine. She was not looking in my direction. Then she was. She held the look for exactly as long as it took to establish that she had looked and not looked away immediately. Then she returned to her conversation with Holt. Thea, beside me, said nothing for a moment. Then, how long has that been going on? Nothing is going on. Right. We are professional colleagues who disagree about typography. Thea tilted her head. Thea was 53 and had been watching people in this industry for 25 years and had developed the specific diagnostic clarity of someone who had given up being polite about what she observed. She said, "She has been aware of where you are in this room for the past 4 minutes and has not looked directly at you once until just now. She's thorough," was all there was to say. Thea said, "You are both thorough. That's not what I'm describing." The subject changed. Thea let it, which was one of the things worth valuing about her. The morning session began at 9. Sitting in the audience was the deliberate choice, hearing her keynote in full rather than preparing in my room and arriving for the afternoon, with only an abstract's worth of Vale's argument in my possession. If we were going to have this conversation publicly, it was going to be after actually listening. She walked out to the podium with the unhurried quality she brought to all movement. She adjusted the microphone once. She looked at the audience with the particular composure of someone who was not performing calm, but simply was it. Then she began. Against the legible was not the argument I had expected. The case I had been preparing to respond to was technically rigorous, formally positioned, the kind that wins by narrowing its terms until the counterargument has nowhere to stand. What she made instead was more dangerous. She talked about the difference between communication and meaning, about the way the design industry's obsession with clarity had produced a visual landscape that said everything efficiently and felt nothing specifically, about work that was optimized for comprehension at the expense of resonance. She used 3 case studies, and 2 of the 3 were from studios whose work I respected, and 1 of the 3 was mine. Not mine by name. By approach. By the specific methodology I had built Meridian's reputation on. She did not make it cruel. She made it precise, which was more difficult to dismiss. Sitting in the audience, the particular texture of being seen clearly and challenged honestly arrived in full. 4 years of 4-minute hallway conversations, the argument running underneath all of them. She finished. The room applauded with the specific energy of people who had been given something to think about and were not sure yet whether they were grateful for it. She stepped off the stage. She did not look toward the audience. She did not look for me. She walked off with the same quality of movement she had walked on with. My afternoon keynote was titled, "In Defense of the Understood." The podium at 2:15, 500 people. Vile's argument still in the room. It had not left. It was sitting in the air the way arguments sit when they are good enough to linger. And then the counter-argument. About meaning that arrives. About the difference between work that withholds its logic and work that delivers it without apology. About the specific discipline required to make something clear without making it simple. The case studies were mine. The language was, by design, in direct conversation with the language she had used that morning. Midway through the 3rd section, there she was. Back of the room. She had come back for the afternoon, standing at the far wall with her arms folded and her weight back on one heel, listening with the focused, frontal attention she brought to things she was taking seriously, not checking her phone, not talking to the person beside her. Listening to an argument against her argument with the complete and slightly unsettling attention of someone who found it worth the time. The keynote ended. The room applauded. The back exit opened into the hallway where Vile was already positioned against the wall with her phone in her hand, and she straightened when I came through. The Callaway typography was not the point she had been making, she said. It was the point being made in response, was the only way to answer that. Something in her expression shifted. Not softened. Adjusted. Your middle section changed, she said. 3 days ago, she said. After you read my abstract. After reading it, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she held up her phone. She had pulled up the Meridian submission for the awards. Look at the secondary grid, she said. And then she pressed the phone against my sternum and left it there. The screen was facing her, which meant the gesture had no practical function. She could not show me the secondary grid with the phone pressed flat against my chest. What the gesture had was her hand, the warmth of it, the deliberate flatness of a palm that had landed and then decided, in the space of one breath, not to lift. The argument continued around the hand. She was saying something about the secondary grid. The secondary grid existed in approximately the same register as the hallway, and the temperature and the distant sound of the afternoon sessions resuming. A real thing, but not the one I was currently inside. Her eyes moved from the phone to my face. She had been saying something about the grid. She was no longer saying something about the grid. The hand was still there. Your abstract set against the legible. She said, yes. But the work you cited wasn't illegible. It was just specific. Her jaw shifted. Not tension. Consideration. She said, the specificity is what makes it legible, in the wrong direction. There is no wrong direction for specificity. She said, there is, when it forecloses what the viewer brings. You can't design for what you don't know the viewer will bring. She said, that is exactly what I'm saying you should do. You're describing faith in the audience as a design principle. She said, yes. That is not a principle. That's a preference dressed as a principle. Her hand lifted. She stepped back. She looked at the expression on my face with the particular attention that had been catalogued over 4 years and named nothing. Not irritation, not admiration, just the clear, oriented focus of someone working through something harder than the surface thing. She said, you came back to the reception. Already at the reception, yes. She said, after the awards year. After you presented my work, you came back and stayed for the full evening. Nothing came back. She said, I noticed. The hallway was mostly clear. 2 people passed, far enough not to register. Somewhere inside the auditorium, a new session had started. The work warranted staying was the truest thing to say about it. She said, I know. That isn't why I mentioned it. A look held in the space between us. What happens after the summit? She said, we go back to New York. Both of us are based in New York. She said, I know. 4 summit conversations and 0 New York conversations. She said, I know. She looked at me. The composure did not crack. It adjusted slightly at the edges, the way things adjust when they are accommodating something they were not entirely prepared for. She said, I thought you preferred the professional distance. The distance was hers to have set, as far as anyone could tell. She said, I was following your lead. The room required a moment to reprocess that. She said, you are very good at standing next to someone and giving them nothing. A 4-minute panel argument in year 1. She said, which you kept at exactly 4 minutes and then left. You were about to say something and then didn't. She was quiet for a moment. Then, yes, I was. The hallway was quiet. The session sounds from inside had settled into the low register of an audience actively listening. Outside the glass wall at the end of the corridor, the lake was doing what the lake does in October. Gray and enormous and indifferent. What were you going to say? She looked across the full distance between where we were standing. The composure was present. The thing underneath it was present. Neither was pretending the other didn't exist. She said, that the work you described on the panel was the first time someone had described geometry as intention rather than as outcome. And that I wanted to tell you that. Why didn't you? She said, because you closed the distance before I got there. The word distance arrived with its full weight. She said, "You always close the distance at exactly the moment the conversation is about to become something else. That is a significant accusation." She said, "It is an observation. What is anyone supposed to do with it?" She said, "Stop." Looking at her, the composure and the thing beneath it, and the October light at the end of the corridor, she said, "Stop closing it." The hallway was very quiet. "The evening session starts in 20 minutes. She said, "I know." "Thea at 7. She said, "I know." She mentioned it. Thea had said something apparently. She said, "She came to find me after my keynote." "What did she say?" She said, "That you had been watching me navigate this room for 4 years and had not said a thing about it." Thea is an observant person. She said, "She is." She also said you were frustrating to watch. She'll be told she was wrong. She said, "Were you watching?" Looking at her, Vielle Marchetti, who had pressed a phone against my chest in a hotel hallway and left her hand there until she remembered she was leaving it, and who had just asked a direct question with the complete and slightly unnerving directness she brought to everything. "Yes." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "Have dinner with Thea at 7. Tell her she was not wrong. And after?" She said, "Come find me after." She walked back toward the auditorium, standing in the hallway, the lake visible through the glass at the end of the corridor. October light getting thin and gold, the word stop, and what it cost to take it seriously. Thea, at dinner, asked whether there had been a conversation with Vale. There had been one, yes. She said, "Did you stop talking about typography?" Eventually, Thea put her fork down. She looked with the expression of someone who had waited a long time for a correction in the data and was finally, cautiously watching it occur. She said, "Good." It came out that Thea had talked to her. She said, "Somebody had to." That was not her intervention to make. Thea said, "It was 4 years." "That's not," Thea said. "4 years, Cass. I have watched you circle the same woman at the same conference for 4 years and say nothing that wasn't designed to keep her at exactly arm's length. You are one of the sharpest people I know, and you have been deliberately incurious about the one subject that warranted curiosity." The plate was easier to look at than Thea's face for a moment. She set the distance, came out at last. Thea said, "You maintained it." "That's the same thing," she said. "It really isn't." A moment of quiet. The restaurant was warm and city loud and doing its job of providing the ambient cover that honest conversations sometimes require. What she had said, that the distance was always closed at the moment conversations became something else, that was accurate. Thea said, "Yes. She's right." Thea said, "I know." "So does she." "What happens if the closing stops?" Thea looked across the table. 53 years old and 25 years in rooms full of people who made things and had feelings about making things and about each other. And she had the specific patience of someone who had seen enough endings to know what a beginning looked like. She said, "Then stop. That's all it is." The hotel bar at 9:15. Vale was at the far end with a glass of something that was not wine this time, looking at her phone loosely. Waiting rather than working. She looked up when the seat beside her, not across beside, was taken. Thea was not wrong, was all there was to offer. She said, "I know." She knew before being told. She said, "I told you. She came to find me." She finds things uncomfortable to watch, apparently. The corner of Vale's mouth moved. 1 millimeter in the way of someone who finds something amusing and has not decided whether to let the amusement be visible. She said, "The secondary grid on the Callaway identity was the first thing you designed that I thought was deliberately unresolved." "It was," she said. "Why?" The reasoning had lived in the work itself. The client's audience was going to bring their own resolution, and the design should support that rather than foreclose it. Vale had been right about that one specific piece. The secondary grid was designed for what the viewer would bring. She said, and the argument she'd made publicly versus the practice on the floor, there was a contradiction there that deserved naming. 2 years inside her principal while arguing against it. She was quiet. The bar was warm and low-lit, producing the specific background sound of 40 people choosing to be somewhere comfortable on a conference evening. She said, "You rewrote the middle section of your keynote 3 days ago." She said, "Why the middle section specifically?" Because the middle section was where the argument was most directly opposed to her position. And after reading the abstract, it was clear the target had been a simplified version, not the actual argument. She said, "You had been arguing against a straw man, against the version that was easier to defeat." She said, "For 4 years. For 4 years." A silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind that has weight in the right direction. She said, "Why?" Because the real version of her argument was harder to dismiss, and something in the work for the past 2 years had known that. She looked at her glass, then back. She said, "Why didn't you want to admit it?" Because admitting she was right about the argument meant thinking about what else might have been wrong. She said, "What else were you wrong about?" "The distance." She held the look. A distance had been maintained, called it professional and correct and appropriate for 2 colleagues who disagreed about design principles. And what it actually was, if honest, was a way to stay close enough to argue while staying far enough to not have to say anything true. She set her glass down. She said, "That is the most honest thing you have said to me in 4 years." "It is," she said. "What changed?" "You put your hand on my chest and left it there." A silence. She said, "That was an accident. The leaving it there wasn't." She looked back. Something in her face moved. Not the composure dissolving, but resettling around something more honest. She said, "No. The leaving it there wasn't." The bar went on around us. A group near the entrance was laughing about something specific to the afternoon sessions. The bartender was managing 3 conversations simultaneously with the practiced multitasking of someone whose job required selective hearing. "What were you going to say?" Year 1. The panel. There was something forming that got stopped. She said, "I was going to say that the argument you had just made was the most technically precise thing anyone had said in that session, and that it was frustrating because I didn't have a good counter to it." "That's all?" She said, "That and that. You were the only person in the room I actually wanted to argue with." "Wanted," she said. Present tense. "I still want to." Looking at her. The woman who had been in every room worth being in for 4 years and had made those rooms more interesting and more difficult in equal measure. Who had stood at a podium that morning and made the argument I had been waiting for someone to make properly, and had made it at me, specifically, in the way of people who are arguing toward someone rather than at them. Tomorrow shouldn't end without a real conversation. She said, "We're having one now. A complete one." She said, "That will take longer than tonight." "It will." She said, "New York. New York." She said, "When?" "Saturday. Lunch. Somewhere that isn't a conference and doesn't have a program guide." The corner of her mouth moved again. This time it was not 1 millimeter. It was something more, and she let it be more, and that specific letting was the thing I would think about on the flight home. She said, "Saturday lunch?" "Yes." She said, "I'll bring my position on the secondary grid. Mine will be there too." She said, "Good." We stayed at the bar for another hour and 40 minutes. The conversation covered the Callaway identity and the summit's spatial acoustics, and a project she was working on that she had not discussed publicly yet, and a project rarely discussed at all. And by the time we walked out into the hotel lobby, the city outside had gone fully dark, and the lake was invisible, and the conference had resolved into its overnight quiet. At the elevator bank she stopped. She said, "You stayed for the full evening. The awards year?" "Yes." She said, "I watched you leave." That was visible to her then. She said, "I thought you were going to come back." The sidewalk outside the reception. 6 minutes standing on it. She said, "I waited 20 minutes." She said it quietly, without accusation. Just the fact of it. 20 minutes. Standing in a room full of the industry's annual performance of itself, waiting for a woman who had been watching her all evening and had chosen the door. "I'm sorry," was the only honest thing. She said, "It was 2 years ago. It was still a thing that happened." She held the look. She said, "Saturday. Saturday." The elevator came. She stepped in. She did not look back this time. Not because she was turning away from anything, but because she was someone who moved forward and trusted that the people worth moving with would follow. The doors closed. The lobby. Then the button for 14. 2 hours without sleep, which felt entirely appropriate. Saturday arrived without urgency, which was the right quality for a conversation I had been waiting 4 years to have. The restaurant was 3 blocks from Meridian's studio, and half a block from a park that went gold in October and had the specific acoustic quality of outdoor spaces that absorb city noise without eliminating it. A place that had been there for 20 years and knew how to feed people who needed to talk. Corner table. Enough ambient sound to be private. Enough light to see faces. She arrived 2 minutes before me. She was at the table when I came in a dark jacket and a gray shirt, and no conference badge, no lanyard, no professional frame. She looked like a person sitting at a table waiting for someone she had agreed to wait for. She looked up when I came in. No preamble. "Tell me the rest of the argument," was what had to be said. "The version you actually believe, not the version that works on a panel." She looked at me. She said, "You first." The position on clarity as service, the belief that the designer's job is to make the work as transparent to the viewer's understanding as possible without being obvious. The belief that withholding meaning in the name of resonance is a form of condescension, a decision to make the audience work for something they should be trusted to receive. She said, "You believe in reception, in communication." She said, "I believe in encounter. The difference between communicating something and putting something in a room where it can be encountered. The first is a delivery mechanism. The second is an invitation. Invitations can be declined." She said, "Yes. That's the point. You're designing for the possibility of refusal." She said, "I'm designing for the possibility of choice." The distinction landed. She said, "I believe you. But," she said, "but I think you use precision as a limit in one direction. You have decided that the understood is the goal and everything else is either pretension or failure, and that decision closes you off to a category of work that operates differently. Work like yours." She said, "Work like mine." Presenting her award to 500 people and describing the geometry as intentional rather than decorative, that description was accurate when spoken. She said, "I know. That was the problem." "How is that a problem?" She said, "Because you were willing to honor the work and not willing to say that it changed anything for you. You stepped off the podium and went back to your table, and the next day, your studio submitted the Callaway identity, which was everything you had just honored, except in a different register. You can hold both things and not let them touch each other. That's very disciplined. It's also a choice about how close you're willing to let anything get." The food arrived. Neither of us acknowledged it for a moment. "You're talking about more than design," she said. "I have been talking about more than design since year 1. The admission of that was not fast in coming." She said. You've known for a while. Yes. She said. And? The both things not touching each other structure. That was the architecture. Very precise. Very maintainable. She said. What changed? The hand. On the chest. In the hallway. She looked at me. A very precise distance had been maintained for 4 years. The hand was not precise. It happened and then it stayed, and she felt it stay, and it was felt that she felt it. And then neither of us could go back to the prior arrangement because we had both been caught being real for one simultaneous second. A silence. She said, I didn't plan it. It's known. She said, I was making a point about the grid. You weren't. She said, not entirely. Not at all. She looked at her glass. Something in her shoulders settled. She said, no. Not at all. We ate. The restaurant did its job. 2 hours covering the panel and the keynote, and the 5 years before either of us had been at the summit, where her argument came from and where mine came from, and the specific rooms and the specific projects, and the specific moments that had made us the people who would inevitably end up in the same 4-year argument about the relationship between legibility and meaning. After 2 hours, the question came out. What would you have done if the door had been gone back through that night? The awards year? If you'd come back in instead of standing on the sidewalk for 6 minutes. She was quiet for a moment. She said, I would have said I was glad you came back. And then? She said, and then I would have said that I had been wanting to argue with you properly since the first panel, and that the argument I wanted to have was not the one about typography. What argument did you want to have? She said, the one about why we were both so good at saying interesting things to each other and nothing real. The self-examination that required was not comfortable. She said, I am very good at argument. It is the most comfortable way I know to be close to someone. The argument gives me a reason to pay attention and a structure for the attention and a way to leave when the attention gets to be too much. I have been using it for 4 years. As have you, came the only honest response. She said, yes. Do you want to stop? She said, I want to use it differently. What does differently look like? She said, like this. Saying the true thing alongside the design argument instead of it. That's possible. It's being demonstrated right now, actually. 2 hours of things not said to anyone else in this industry. That's evidence. She said, can you? She said, I have been sitting across from you for 2 hours saying things I have not said to anyone else in this industry. That is evidence. She almost smiled. The corner of her mouth, both of them this time. She said, that is evidence. And the keynote got rewritten. She said, I know. For her, specifically. So that the argument was in actual conversation with her argument rather than in conversation with a simplified version of it. She looked across. Something in her face moved that was not the composure and not the argument. Just the true thing, without a frame. She said, I came back for your afternoon session. Visible from the stage. She said, I have come back for your afternoon session every year. Every year, yes. Looked for her every time. From the podium and from the floor and from the hallway after. Because she was the only person in the building whose reaction actually mattered. She said, and when you found me? Always the same. The appropriate amount of space left and called professional. She said, you're not doing that now. No. She said, what changed? Stopped closing it. A long silence. October light through the restaurant windows, going amber. The city doing its city things around us. She said, what do you want? To keep arguing with you. In New York. In rooms that are not a conference. On the subject of design and on all the subjects that aren't design. She said, that's a large amount of contact for 2 people who have been operating on a 4-minute limit. It is. She said, "You might find you don't like me without the professional frame, finding you impossible with it. Finding out what impossible looks like without it, that seems worth the risk." She looked at me for a long, level moment. She said, "Tuesday. There is a show at the gallery on Mercer I have been meaning to go to. Typography installation. You would have opinions. Many opinions." She said, "I would like to hear them. In 4-minute increments or in full?" The corner of her mouth again. Both this time. Sustained this time. The version that was not 1 millimeter but something more, something that had been waiting to be that specific size and had simply been given, for the first time, permission to be. She said, "In full. Tuesday." She said, "Tuesday." She reached across the table and picked up the small paper sleeve from the sugar bowl and folded it once, twice, into a shape that was nothing specific, and then set it beside my water glass. A small, idle gesture. Her hands when they were not working. Present instead of purposeful. Her hands were worth watching. She said, "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" She said, "Watching. You always watch." "Yes." She said, "What do you see?" "Someone who folds sugar packets when they're comfortable." She looked at the folded paper. She said, "That's new information about myself." "You're welcome." We walked out into the October afternoon. The park was gold the way it had been expected to be. She put her hands in her pockets and looked at it for a moment. It was the kind of October afternoon that the city gets approximately 4 of per year, where the light does something specific to the surfaces of things, the leaves, the buildings at the west end of the park, the specific amber that the avenue takes on when the sun is low and the air is cold, and nothing is in a hurry about it. She said, "The installation on Mercer has a section on unresolved systems. The reaction to that will be contained." She said, "Please don't." We walked into the park. No particular direction, just the gold of it and 2 people who had been in the same rooms for 4 years and were now, for the first time, in the same place. She talked about the installation. She had seen a preview at a friend's studio the week before, and had been thinking about one specific piece ever since, a typographic system built on deliberate lacunae, gaps designed to be completed by the viewer's own visual instinct. She talked about it with the particular animation that appeared in her when she was discussing work she found genuinely interesting, which was the Vael Marchetti that only surfaced in the specific context of actual investment. Not the composed panel presence, not the precise keynote delivery, but the person who could not quite hold still when the idea was good enough. That animation was something worth cataloging. She said, "You're watching again. Hard to stop." She said, "I'll work on being less interesting." That would be a waste of resources. She stopped walking for half a second. The park moved around her and she was briefly still in it, looking at me with an expression that had nothing professional in it at all. Then she started walking again. She said, "When did you stop finding me simply aggravating and start finding me interesting?" The specific moment hadn't been logged. She said, "Take a guess. The film room. At the conference 2 years ago, there was a round table on generative tools that we both attended and disagreed with for separate reasons, and you made an argument about authorship that the moderator completely misread, and you did not correct him because the correction would have required explaining something the room was not equipped to absorb. And you looked at the ceiling for 1 second and decided to let it go. That was the specific moment." She was quiet. She said, "That is a very specific moment. It was a very specific ceiling look." She said, "I remember that round table. I remember you didn't correct him either. The reason was different." She said, "What was your reason?" Because if the correction had been made, the argument she was about to abandon would have continued, and what she was about to abandon was the better position, and it seemed worth watching her choose to let it go rather than fight for it in a room that wasn't capable of the fight. She looked at the path ahead of them for a moment. She said, "That is a very complicated reason for not saying something. 4 years of not saying things. The infrastructure was extensive." She almost laughed. Not quite. The sound it almost made was warmer than anything the conference version of her had ever produced. She said, "I want you to argue against the Mercer installation with me in real time while we're standing in front of it. That's what Tuesday is," she said. "That's what Tuesday is." We walked until the park ended at the Eastern Avenue and stood on the pavement watching the late afternoon traffic do its October Friday things. Taxis, cyclists, a dog walker managing 4 entirely different ideas of urgency at once. She said, "I am going to keep being difficult about the grid. The position will hold." She said, "I know. That's why it's interesting." She said it without looking over. The city noise was between us and the park behind us and the cold, doing its patient October work on everything. She meant it the same way she had meant it at the panel 4 years ago. Not as a compliment performing itself, but as the unornamented fact of a thing she found genuinely true. The walk back to the subway happened without urgency. At the entrance she stopped. She said, "Tuesday. Tuesday." She said, "Don't be late. I have a position to defend and I want the full length of the visit. The defense will be thorough." She went down the stairs. At the bottom she looked back up, not to check whether she was being watched, but the way people look back when they have decided something and want the fact of the decision to be mutual. The look lasted 1 second. Then she was gone into the tunnel and the park was behind, and the afternoon was doing its final amber things to the avenue, and something had shifted that had been the same for 4 years, and was now different in a way that would not go back. Tuesday arrived the way good things arrive when you have been waiting for them correctly. Not slowly, not quickly, just at the pace of something that was always going to come and simply required patience in the meantime. The gallery on Mercer was the kind of space that the design world produced in Lower Manhattan with reliable frequency. Exposed concrete, careful lighting, the smell of clean air moving through a room that had been recently repainted in a shade slightly warmer than white. The typography installation had been the subject of 2 industry newsletters and 1 long-form piece in a publication that Vial and I both read, and neither of us ever cited in conversation because citing it would have felt too deliberate. She was already inside when I arrived, not waiting at the entrance, not checking a phone. She was standing in front of the first piece in the installation with her hands in her jacket pockets and her weight settled back, looking at it with the focused attentiveness she brought to things she was prepared to be changed by. She heard me come in, without turning. "You're 4 minutes late. Traffic on Canal." She said, "The L train exists." The L train was not the point, was the only thing to say back to that. She turned. She was in a dark jacket over a gray shirt, and she looked, as she had looked on Saturday at the restaurant, like the civilian version of herself, present without performance, composed without effort. She looked like someone who had decided to be somewhere and was simply being there. She said, "It starts at the back." The installation moved in reverse chronology. The most recent work first, the earliest at the far end, which was the opposite of how exhibitions usually structured themselves and created the particular experience of reading an argument backward before you read it forward. Val had understood this from her preview visit and explained it as we moved through the first section. Her voice low in the gallery, quiet, precise about the choices she found interesting and honest about the ones she found merely clever. "She has an opinion about everything," was the private conclusion. Not performatively, not because she needs to fill space. She has opinions the way some people have vocabulary, extensively, specifically, with the sense that the thing being described matters in itself, and not as an occasion for the describing. She used her hands when she talked about work she loved, not gestural in the broad, theatrical way. Precise. Her hands describe dimensions and relationships, and the specific pressure that a composition puts on its own edges, the way you'd use your hands to describe the weight of a stone rather than its color. She used them the way she used language, economically, but with the sense that the thing being described mattered enough to find the right shape for. What she was doing in the gallery was different from what she did on a panel. The panel version was the argument, externalized and defended. The gallery version was the inquiry. She was genuinely looking, genuinely uncertain in the places where the work hadn't resolved for her yet, and saying so without the professional management that turned uncertainty into a position. She would stop in front of a piece and look at it for a long time without saying anything, and then say something specific and true. And the specific true thing was better than anything she would have said if she had been talking into a microphone. She said, "This one." She stopped at a piece mid-gallery. It was a typographic grid built around a deliberate gap at the center. The text radiated outward from an empty space, organized, purposeful, and the empty space itself was clearly designed, not accidental. The viewer's eye kept returning to the gap and finding, each time, a different shape in it depending on where they were standing. She said, "This is what I was talking about," in the keynote. "The gap is designed," was the observation. "It's not a void. It's a deliberate absence." She said, "Yes. That's not the same as ambiguity." She said, "No. It's more demanding than ambiguity. Ambiguity doesn't care what the viewer brings. This requires something specific from them and refuses to tell them what." The piece was doing exactly that. Standing 2 feet to the left of center, the gap resolved into something that looked almost like a letter. Moving to the right, it became architectural. The work was not unresolved. It was precisely resolved in a way that required the viewer's position to be part of the resolution. "This is your argument," came out, finally admitting it. She said, "Yes. This piece is not against the legible. It's a different kind of legibility." She said, "That's what I've been trying to say for 4 years, and what the keynote didn't quite get to." She looked at the piece. She said, "No, the keynote got to it. The title was wrong." Looking at her, she said, "I called it Against the Legible because I knew you'd read it, and I wanted you in the room for the afternoon session with a specific argument in your head. The title was designed to produce a reaction in one particular person." The gallery was quiet. Someone else was moving through the far end of the installation, but they were far enough away to be irrelevant. "You designed the title as provocation," she said. "I designed it as an invitation to the actual conversation. That is the most elaborate way anyone has ever asked for an argument." She said, "It worked. It did work." The middle section of the keynote got rewritten, attended the morning session, went to the bar afterward and said things that hadn't been said in 4 years. She said, "I know. I was there for all of it." We moved through the rest of the installation at the pace it asked for, which was slow. She talked about the second section's relationship to the first, the way the earlier work in the exhibition was more declarative, and the later work more interrogative. And the reverse chronological structure made you feel the artist discovering uncertainty rather than resolving toward it. She talked about the specific pressure that the central gap piece put on everything around it, the way a strong formal decision in the middle of a body of work retroactively recontextualized everything before it. She was talking about design. The listening was complete, and underneath the design conversation, the other conversation was running. The one about what it meant to be 2 people who had been using the language of their shared discipline to avoid a language they didn't have structures for yet. At the far end of the installation, the earliest work, the most declarative, the period before the artist had learned to trust the gap. She stopped. She said, "I want to tell you something." A silence, waiting for it. She said, "I submitted a response piece to the summit program for next year. It's titled, In Defense of the Understood." looking at her. Fully, she said, with your name on the co-authorship. That hadn't been expected. She said, I want to write it with you. The actual argument, not the two parallel versions we've been giving in separate tracks. I want to write the version where both things are true simultaneously, that precision serves the viewer, and that the gap is also a form of service. I think that version exists. I think we've been circling it for 4 years without being willing to be in the same room long enough to find it. The gallery wall behind her was the warm white that good galleries use, and the light was doing what good gallery light does, and the earliest work in the installation was on the wall beside her, and it was declarative in exactly the way she had described, certain in a way that the later work had learned to hold more lightly. Yes, was the only answer. She said, yes, yes. Co-authorship. Next year's summit. The actual argument. She looked at me for a moment. The composure was present. The thing beneath it was present and not being managed, just existing in the room alongside the composure, which was the version of Vale Marchetti that the conference frame had never produced, and that the restaurant on Saturday and the gallery on Tuesday were producing with what felt like increasing ease. She said, good. She said it the way she said it at the bar. Not as a conclusion, as a beginning. The word carrying the specific weight of someone who has been waiting for a yes and is genuinely, privately glad to receive it. We left the gallery when it closed. Outside on Mercer, the city was doing its Tuesday evening things, the specific traffic pattern of a weekday winding down, the particular quality of the light in lower Manhattan in October when it comes off glass buildings at a low angle and makes everything look briefly more considered than it is. She said, there's a place on Spring that does a very specific noodle dish that I have been meaning to eat for 3 months and have not been able to justify eating alone. That is an extremely long setup for a dinner invitation. She said, it's an accurate one. We walked to Spring. We ate the noodle dish, which was, as she had implied, specific and worth the 3 months. We talked about the installation and the co-authorship and the summit submission process, and somewhere in the second half of dinner the conversation stopped being about those things and became about other things, where she had studied, which was London and then Berlin, where the argument about legibility had actually started for her, which was a professor in Berlin who had said the most designed thing about graphic language she had ever heard and then turned out to be completely wrong about the practical application of it. What she thought about the industry's current relationship to generative tools, which was complicated in the way she found most things complicated. Not opposed to them, not credulous about them, honest about what they required and what they didn't yet understand about their own requirements. She talked about her work in a way she didn't talk about it at panels, less defended, more genuinely uncertain in the places where she was uncertain. She talked about a project she had walked away from last spring because she had reached the middle of it and understood that the client's brief and her own instincts were not reconcilable, and that she had been telling herself they were because the project was visible, and the client was well connected, and neither of those things was a good enough reason to produce work she didn't believe in. That must have cost something, came out. She said, it cost a client relationship and 2 months of revenue, and it was the right call. You knew when you made it, she said. I knew before I made it. I made it later than I should have. She said it without self-punishment. Just the fact of it, which was the version of honesty she brought to everything. Not confessional, not performative, just accurate. The restaurant thinned out around them. When the check arrived, she reached for it. The instinct to split it was already in motion. She said, I invited you. You haven't actually invited me anywhere. You described a noodle dish and implied an invitation. She said, that counts. It doesn't count. She said, I have the check. The argument about the check lasted approximately 45 seconds and was the most genuinely comfortable argument that had happened between us since the first panel, which told something specific about where things had arrived. She paid. Outside on Spring, she stood with her hands in her jacket pockets and looked at the street. She said, "The co-authorship." "Yes," she said. "I want to be clear that it is also a reason to keep talking to you in rooms that aren't conferences. It's known," she said. "I want to hear you say it's known." "It's known, Vale." She said, "Good." She said it again, that specific word, and it landed the same way it had landed in the bar. Not as an ending, as a permission. The permission to take the next step without explaining all the steps that had preceded it. She said, "I'll send you the draft framework for the submission by Thursday." "Thursday," she said. "Don't rewrite it before we've talked. The framework will be read and held." She said, "Held, held," and then aggressively annotated. The corner of her mouth moved. Both sides. Sustained. The version she had been allowing more frequently since Saturday, and that had not yet lost its effect, which suggested it would not lose it for a very long time. She said, "That's fair." She turned and walked toward the subway. At the corner, she looked back. 1 second. The same look she had given at the restaurant on Saturday. The mutual acknowledgement of a decision made. Then she was around the corner and gone. The walk home was longer than necessary, the city in October at 9 in the evening, doing its specific things. The paper sleeve she had folded at the restaurant table was in the jacket pocket. Had been there since Saturday without a plan for it. Kept it. That seemed like enough. The submission framework arrived Thursday morning at 7:14, which was the hour of a person who had been awake for a while before sending it. It was 12 pages. It was also, in the structure of its argument, the most honest piece of professional writing she had shared, not because it was personal, but because the uncertainties in it were real uncertainties, not managed ones. The sections where she wasn't sure were marked as sections where she wasn't sure. The sections where she was sure were built with the precision of someone who had thought about this long enough that the certainty was genuine. The annotations took 3 hours. Not because the framework needed 3 hours of annotation. It needed the annotations it needed. The 3 hours were because reading her think was something that required time to do properly. She structured an argument the way she structured a design system, from the load-bearing decisions outward, with the understanding that everything peripheral would be legible only if the center held. The center of this framework was a claim about viewer responsibility that she had been building toward since the first panel and had never quite stated this flatly, and seeing it stated this flatly in a document with both their names on it was a thing that required sitting with before it could be annotated. She responded to the annotations at 2 in the afternoon. These are good. The third section needs more of this. On Saturday morning, she sent a revised draft. On Sunday evening, the response went back, with the second section restructured. By the following Thursday, they had a document that was neither her argument nor the argument made at the summit, but something that had come from the actual conversation, the one that had been running since the panel 4 years ago and had finally been allowed into a room large enough to have it in. The process of writing with her was unlike any collaborative work done before. Most collaboration in this industry operated through deference, one person's vision, another person's execution, with the power dynamic sutured into the credit. What she did was different. She pushed back on every sentence that wasn't earning its place. She asked, 3 separate times during the drafting process, whether a particular phrase was the right phrase or the convenient one. She was not difficult to work with. She was demanding in the specific way of someone who expected the same quality of thought from a collaborator that she applied to herself, which was the most respectful form of difficulty there was. She sent a message on a Wednesday afternoon, mid-draft. "I want to use the Callaway secondary grid as a case study. That's my work." She said, I know. That's why I'm asking. You can use it. What's the argument? She said that the grid was designed using the principle I've been defending publicly, while you were defending the opposite principle publicly, and neither of us said so. I want to put that in the paper. That is going to require both of us to be honest about the contradiction. She said, yes. That's the point. She was right. That was the point. The Callaway grid went into the paper as Exhibit A of the argument resolving itself in practice before it had resolved in theory, which was the most honest thing the paper contained and the thing that made it worth submitting. She sent a message at 11 on a Thursday night. This is the argument I've been trying to make for 4 years. You made it better. The response came without waiting. You gave it something it couldn't have had if it was only yours. A pause. Then, accurate. Don't tell anyone I agreed with you. The agreement goes in the document. It's already there. Another pause. Then, Thursday dinner. I found a different noodle place. Thursday dinner. She said, it might be better. The bar is high. She said, I know. The co-authored submission went to the Summit Program Committee in November. The acceptance came in January. The session title they were given was Toward a Unified Theory of Legibility, which was not the title either of them had proposed, but which the committee had evidently derived from reading the actual argument and then naming it more plainly than they had. She messaged when the acceptance arrived. They renamed it. They named it what it is. She said, that's irritating. It's accurate. She said, accuracy is occasionally irritating. You've said that about my work for 4 years. She said, I've said it about your work because it was true. I'm saying it about this because it's also true, and it happens to apply to both of us simultaneously, which is a new experience. That's what co-authorship is. She said, I'm adjusting. By January, they had established the rhythm that Tuesdays and some Thursdays had settled into. Not named, not formalized, just the shape that the weeks had taken on. Studio and gallery and the noodle place, and twice a restaurant she had found that served Georgian food in a room that was too loud and too warm and exactly right for the kind of conversation they were having, which required a little ambient cover to unfold honestly. She had opinions about Georgian food that were consistent and specific and revealed. Over 3 visits, that she had spent 6 months in Tbilisi early in her career and had not spoken about it to anyone in the industry because she considered it private. She told me about it on the second visit, between the bread and the stew, without making it a declaration. Just, there it was. 6 months in Tbilisi. The light there in winter. The specific quality of the work she had made in that period that she had never shown publicly because it was too unresolved, which was the period that had produced the argument she had been making ever since. She told it without the professional frame that she wore to conferences and client presentations and industry dinners. She told it the way people tell things they have been keeping for a while. Not urgently, not with the weight of the long withholding, just with the quiet of something finally finding the right room for it. Tbilisi in February. A residency that was supposed to last 3 months and extended itself to 6 because the work was happening, and stopping it would have meant interrupting something that needed to finish at its own pace. An apartment near the old town with a window that caught the specific winter light of that city, which was gray in a way that was generous rather than bleak. 12 pieces made in that apartment. None of them shown. All of them kept. She described them without showing them. The descriptions were precise in the way her arguments were precise, not approximate, not impressionistic, but specific to the exact decisions and the exact uncertainties and the exact moment in each piece where she had stopped, because the thing she was trying to resolve had refused to resolve, and she had needed to learn to leave it there. That's what the argument came from when the only thing there was to say. The 12 pieces. The things that wouldn't resolve. She said, yes. You built a decade of public work on the thing you weren't ready to show anyone. She said, That's what early work is for. Not everyone does that honestly. She said, I know. Most people resolve it before they show it. The resolution is a loss. You've been defending the pre-resolution. She said, I've been defending the right to stay in it. Yes. The bread arrived. The conversation moved on. But that sentence stayed. The right to stay in it. And it sat alongside everything else that had been accumulating since October, and took up the specific space of something that mattered beyond its immediate context, the unresolved work that produced the argument she'd been carrying for a decade. She said, Yes, you've been defending work you've never shown anyone. She said, I've been defending the principle. The work is separate. Would you show it? She looked at her bread. She said, To some people. To the co-author? She said, Eventually. When it feels less like a deposition. That's not a no. She said, It's a not yet. Not yet was something to sit with. Not yet from Vale Marchetti, who managed everything with such precise calibration, meant, the door is open. It means, the timeline is mine and I trust you to understand that. It meant something specific about where things had arrived. The months between November and the following October had a specific texture that it was worth describing accurately. They were not the 4 years that had preceded them. The 4 years had a texture of productive distance. The specific electricity of two people who were always in the same rooms and managing the fact carefully. The months that followed were different. Closer and less managed and more honest in the way that things become honest when the structure that was managing them has been set down. The co-authorship gave them a framework that didn't need to be called anything other than what it was. They were writing something together. The writing required conversation. The conversation required honesty about what each of them actually thought. Not the panel version, not the keynote version, but the 3 in the afternoon version when a section wasn't working and needed someone else's eyes on why. She was difficult to write with in the specific way that made writing better. She rejected 3 consecutive drafts of the opening section with annotations that were accurate and unkind in the constructive sense. Not unkind about the person, unsparing about the work. She said once, looking at a paragraph that had taken 2 hours, This is the convenient version. What's the true one? The true one took another hour and was better. She sent flowers in December for no stated reason. A small arrangement that arrived at the Meridian studio with a card that said, The 3rd section is good. The flowers were the same color as the October park. On a Wednesday in February, she sent a message at 10 in the evening. Are you awake? The response went back. Yes. She said, I'm at the studio. The Aldrin project. Aldrin was a long-form identity project she had mentioned twice in passing. A museum client. Significant. The kind of work that required the particular patience of someone who understood that the right answer sometimes needed to be found rather than designed. She had been working late on it for 3 weeks. How's it going? She said, I found the gap. A pause while that landed. Tell me. What came back was 3 images, photographs of work pinned to a wall, the kind of studio documentation that she clearly made for herself rather than for sharing. The work on the wall was at an intermediate stage, not finished, not preliminary, somewhere in the middle where the decisions had been made, but not yet resolved into their final form, and in the center of the composition on the wall, a deliberate empty space. Not accidental. Designed. The gap at the center. She'd been right about the museum client. She said, I've been circling it for 6 weeks. I kept designing around it instead of designing it. What made you find it tonight? She said, the gallery piece. On Mercer. I've been thinking about it since Tuesday. The Tuesday from 4 months ago. She had been thinking about the piece on Mercer since the first Tuesday. She said, Don't read too much into the timeline, reading exactly as much as is appropriate. She said, Which is? You found the gap on a Wednesday in February thinking about a piece you saw in October. The timeline is the timeline. A pause. She said, I want to show you the Aldrin work when it's done. That's not a deposition. She said, No, it isn't. The Aldrin project was shown to me in March. Not publicly. In her studio. On a Thursday evening after the rest of the staff had gone, with the work spread across the central table and the studio lights doing the specific thing studio lights do when the room is otherwise empty. She stood at the edge of the table and walked through it the way she walked through arguments. From first principles, without shortcuts, with the particular patience of someone who believed the listener was worth the full account. The work was the best thing she had made. It was evident from the first piece and confirmed by everything that followed. The museum client was going to receive something that would still be discussed in 15 years, which was the specific measure she applied to her own work and which she had not said aloud, but which was visible in how she held herself while explaining it. When she finished, she stepped back and looked at the table. Well, was all there was to say. She said, Yes or no? Yes. She said, Yes what? Yes, it's the best thing you've made. Yes, the gap works. Yes, the client is going to have something they'll spend the next decade growing into. Yes, all of it. She looked at the table. She said, I showed you the unresolved work. From Tbilisi. Last week. You did. She said, 12 pieces, most of which I have not shown to another person. 12 pieces that were the origin of the argument she had been making for a decade, unfinished, uncertain, genuinely in progress in the way that early work is in progress, not rough, not incomplete, but honestly mid-thought. Looking at them had felt like reading someone's actual thinking rather than their conclusions, which was the most intimate professional experience of 2 decades of working in this industry. They deserve to be seen, she said. You said that, when you saw them. They deserved it then. They still do. She said, I'm considering showing 2 of them, publicly, as part of a piece I've been asked to write about the early conditions that produce a body of work. That's the right 2, the ones with the unresolved grid. She said, Yes. Those are the ones. She had not yet told me which 2. It was accurate anyway. She said, How did you know which 2? Because they're the ones that the Mercer piece came from. The Mercer piece is those 2, resolved. You can see the exact moment of resolution between them if you line them up. She was quiet for a long time. She said, I have never shown anyone the Tbilisi work. You told me that. She said, I'm telling you again because it matters that you know I know what it means that I showed it to you. It's understood. She said, What does it mean to you? Looking at her. In the studio with the work on the table and the Thursday evening light doing its specific things to the room, and Vile standing at the edge of the table with her hands at her sides, rather than in her pockets for once, not reaching for anything, not containing anything, just present with her hands open. It means you trust me with the version of your work that exists before it's ready to be an argument. That's different from trusting me with the argument. She said, Yes, it means the 4-year frame we were operating in is not the frame anymore. She said, No, it isn't. What frame is it now? She said, I don't have a name for it yet. Neither do I. She said, Does it need one? Looking at her. The work on the table? The 12 pieces from Tbilisi that she had shown on a different Thursday in her studio, 2 of which were going to be seen publicly for the first time and the rest of which lived in a flat file in the back corner of the room and had been there for a decade waiting for someone she trusted enough to look at them. No, it doesn't need one. She moved from the edge of the table toward where the studio narrowed near the window. The street below was doing its Thursday things. She stood at the window for a moment without saying anything. The studio at that hour was the particular quiet of a working space after the work has been shown. Not empty, not finished, just held. The work on the table, the light, The fact of being in her actual space rather than a conference room or a restaurant or a gallery, where both of them were visitors rather than inhabitants. She had a way of holding herself at windows that was different from how she held herself elsewhere. Less contained, like she was allowing the space between the glass and the street to carry something she wasn't carrying herself. The light from below caught the line of her jaw and the slope of her shoulder, and she was looking at the street with the focused inward quality of someone working something out, before saying it. Then she turned around. She said, "I have been managing the distance between us for 4 years with the argument. I want to stop managing it." "Then stop." She said, "I'm telling you, I'm stopping. That's what this is." "It's understood." She said, "I need you to say something back that isn't just understood and it's known and yes." "What do you need to hear?" She said, "Whatever is actually true." Whatever is actually true. 4 years of the same rooms, 4 keynotes, 2 sponsored roundtables, 1 award presentation, a hotel hallway in Chicago, and a bar at 9:15, and a restaurant on Saturday, and a gallery on Tuesday, and a noodle place on Spring Street, and 3 visits to the Georgian restaurant, and 12 pieces of unresolved work from Tbilisi that no one else had been trusted with, and a co-authored argument that neither of them could have made alone. The distance closed. Her hands came up and settled at the sides of her face, warm and certain. The way someone touches something they have decided to stop being careful about. The composure was present. The decision beneath it was present. Neither one was pretending the other didn't exist. When she kissed me, it was the thing her argument had always been describing and never quite reaching. Not the declarative version, not the precisely resolved system, but the gap in the center that required something specific from the person standing in front of it. Patient. Exact. The restraint finally becoming something honest instead of disciplined. She stepped back. She looked at the work on the table. She looked at me. She said, "The summit submission. Next October." She said, "We should add a case study." "What case study?" She said, "The one about what happens when the argument becomes the thing instead of a way to avoid the thing. That's going to be difficult to title." She said, "We'll figure it out." She said it with the composure and with the thing beneath it, and with the corner of her mouth doing the version it had been doing since the park in October. Sustained. Both sides. The version that had permission to be its actual size. She went back to the Aldrin work. There were still decisions to finalize. The gap at the center needed 1 more hour. She worked and the staying happened. Not because there was more to discuss, but because the studio at night with the work on the table and Vielle being exactly herself in it was a room worth being in. She worked in the focused silence of someone entirely inside a problem. Not tense, not performing concentration, just present with the decisions in a way that closed the room around them. She printed something, looked at it against the pinned work on the wall, made a mark on it with a black pen, printed again. She did this 4 times. On the 5th print, she went still. She held it at arm's length, then closer, then at arm's length again. Then she set it down and stepped back. She said, "That's it." She was not talking to anyone in particular. She was talking to the work and to the room and to the problem she had been solving for 6 weeks. The print had the gap. The gap was right. The rest of the system aligned around it with the specific formal economy of a decision that had arrived at last and been exactly correct. "That's what it looks like when you find it," came the observation. She turned. She looked at me across the studio as if she had momentarily forgotten there was someone else in the room and was recalibrating to the fact of it. She said, "Yes, that's what it looks like." She looked at the print for another moment. She said, "I'm glad you stayed. Glad to be here for it." She said, "For the work specifically or in general?" "In general," was the honest answer. The work was secondary. She said nothing for a moment. Then she almost smiled. the corner of both, the full version, and went back to the table to do the final adjustments. At 11, she looked up from the table. She said, "You're still here." "Still here," she said. "Good." The Aldrin project was delivered in April. The museum director sent a letter. Actual paper, formal language, the kind of response institutions produce when they understand they have received something lasting. Vale read it once, folded it precisely, and filed it without comment. Then she sent a message at 6 in the evening. "The submission framework for next year's summit needs a second section. Can you be at the studio at 9 tomorrow?" 9 tomorrow, she said. "Bring the annotations." All of them. I want to start from the actual disagreements. That's where we've always started. She said, "Yes." This time on purpose. The summit the following October was the first time we had appeared on the same stage, not on adjacent tracks, not in separate keynotes with the audience measuring one against the other, on the same stage, with a single presentation, making a single argument that had taken 4 years of circling and 12 months of actual conversation to find. She opened. It was the right call, and she knew it before it was suggested. Her version of the argument set the terms better than mine, which was the kind of thing that becomes easy to say when the argument is genuinely shared and not defended. In the 40 minutes of the presentation, she was precise and exacting and moved through the work with the economy of someone who understood that the audience's attention was a finite resource and wasting it was a form of disrespect. She gave them the gap at the center. She gave them the Mercer piece as a case study. She gave them the Aldrin grid as the applied example of what the unified theory actually produced in practice. She did not give them the Tbilisi work. That stayed where it was. Some things are not for everyone. When she handed the presentation to me for the closing section, she did not look at the audience. She looked at me with the clear level attention she had brought to every room we had ever been in together. Complete, specific, the kind that makes you feel like the most real thing in the space. The closing section was about what happens when two people who have been using an argument to maintain a productive distance finally stop maintaining the distance and find out whether the argument survives the honesty. The answer, which I told 500 people in a glass-walled room in Chicago in October, was yes. The argument got better. The work got better. The thing they had been circling for 4 years turned out to be the most important thing either of them had made, and it had only been possible because one of them pressed a phone to the other's chest in a hotel hallway and left her hand there 1 beat too long. The room went very still in the specific way rooms go still when they have been told something true. Then the applause came. Vale was standing at the side of the stage. She had her hands in her jacket pockets, and she was looking at me with the composure and the thing beneath it, and the corner of her mouth. Both sides, sustained, the full version. The last thing the moderator asked, after the formal session had wound down and the audience was dispersing into the corridor. "How do you two plan to keep working together going forward?" She answered before the question had finished landing. She said, "We'll figure it out. We're good at conversations that take longer than expected. That is an accurate description." She said, "We've had practice." The moderator wrapped the session. The audience dispersed in the slow way of conference audiences that have received more than they expected, not rushing to the corridor, lingering in small groups, processing. A woman in the second row stopped on her way out and said something to Vile about the Mercer Peace case study. Something brief and genuine, and Vile answered with the composure and the warmth she reserved for people asking real questions and not performing admiration. Across the room, a man who had been on 3 panels with me over the past 2 years caught my eye and nodded once. Not congratulatory, just the acknowledgement of something seen. Thea was at the back of the room. She had come for the presentation. She had not mentioned she was coming and had not needed to, because Thea had been at every summit for 25 years and had watched the two of us circle each other for 4 of them and was going to be present for this particular one, whether or not she was invited. She looked at me from across the room. She did not say anything. She gave a single, precise nod, the kind that means, I was right, and I know. You know I was right, and neither of us needs to speak about it. Then she turned and went to find coffee. Walking out of the auditorium and into the conference corridor, and the lake was visible at the far end through the glass, and it was October again, and the light was doing its October things to the water, and neither of us felt the need to explain what came next. It was already happening. It had been happening since a hotel hallway in this city, in this building, 1 year and 1 summit and 1 hand on a chest and 12 months of the actual conversation ago. She said, "There's a new restaurant on Michigan Avenue." "What kind?" She said, "The kind where they know how to leave you alone." "Let's go." She said, "Yes." We walked toward the exit and the city and the thing that had stopped needing a name because it had become the whole shape of the days, which was more than enough, and exactly what they had both been building toward without knowing they were building toward it. From the very first moment she said geometry as intention, and I stayed 4 minutes longer than I had planned, and neither of us walked away clean.